Wish I could see all the Selassie. Maybe my sovereignty will still be mine. If all the gangs in the world unify, we stand a chance against the military tonight. I said we stand a chance against the military tonight. I said we stand a chance against the military tonight. Extra pills! Them AK clips, they extra pill. Smoking on some of that extra kill. Purple, Urkel, that Jaleel. I put that on everything. If we could link up every gang, and niggas is willing to bear the pain, we put the White House lights out today. Okay, KK. We mobbing like we the black KKK. Don't forget my AKA Mayday. P or your PhD or your AA. Hey, dear Barack. I know you're just a puppet, but I'm giving you props. You're lying to the public like it ain't nothing, and I just love it. I hope it don't stop. I don't give a bang that block. I don't give a bang that Glock. I seen the image of Hitler in the picture when the Twin Towers dropped. Peep the concept. You got progress, you got Congress. We protest in hopes they confess. Just proceed on your conquest. I ain't got no gavel. I ain't finna fight nobody battle. I just wanna be free. I ain't finna beat nobody chattel. Wish I could see all the Selassie. Maybe my sovereignty will still be mine. If all the gangs in the world unify, we stand a chance against the military tonight. I said we stand a chance against the military tonight. I said we stand a chance against the military tonight.
Extra pills, nose kinda ring like sofa ring. My baby needs some infamy. Some ass get stuff like Oprah Green. Pull around, come back, oh for real. Top blue off, low fuzzing teeth. Get lined up like homeless me. Feeling if in the hobby and homeless feel. Okay, KK. Don't try to stop it, get in my way. You'll get stumped like a Broadway play. AK melee, make it obey, okay? Feel my pain, going insane. I'm ashamed, cause I ain't got but an EBT card from a fiend that owe me innocent her daughter name. How the is they supposed to eat? How the am I supposed to eat? Got in the streets, no health care, trying to slang just to put shoes on their feet. So you don't give about me. Can't get a job if they drug test me. Got a stressed up press, got a fill out of the chest in a world strip of hat.
Same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with. And this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
It disappeared.
Wait a minute. It didn't disappear.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, USA. Left is best. We got to tell the origin story of that sometime. As always, I'm joined by super producer Matt Leck.
What's up?
Head theoretician David Grishcom.
Hello, everyone.
And super producer David Slavic roaming the digitosphere for us in Discord, Twitter, and everywhere else on this week's program. Natalie from ContraPoint. We are talking about the conundrum that is Jordan Peterson. And somehow, coincidentally with that, bad science. Somehow those two subjects are connected. And then Briahna Joy Gray is talking about controversies around the new article in Harper's, the Me Too movement, making distinctions, and the Trump just assault budget on the poor. Can we have an economic justice platform for everyone? Is that the future? All that and more in studio with crew, Briahna Joy Gray. And we got a guy I actually like, but he just went so whack that he's got to go into the pyramid. Some global news for the shout out. And of course, the post game. It's the Michael Brooks Show. Let's go. Thanks, everybody. Let's start by talking about the United States of Care. Now, yes, it is a really boring name. And yes, it would be awesome if we could all ignore this group. But first, I'm going to tell you what it is briefly and explain one positive signal and then what we need to recognize about it and bigger lessons for us and our politics and our lives. The United States of Care is an AstroTurf group, which has won the support of everybody from Andy Richter to John Favreau of Pod Save America. It's headed by Andy Slavitt, who's a finance guy, major corporate figure, and it calls generically, basically, for universal health care. It's an AstroTurf group to muddy the waters for the grassroots energy and push for single payer. Now, as Brian Grimm pointed out, this is actually very positive news because this means that we are making real headway, pushing for an actual national health insurance program which will cover every single human in this country, period. No nonsense. Universal, full, government-provided health insurance, period. The only path forward in any type of remotely just, decent, and sane society. The corporate sector notices this, and they're responding. The United States of Care is going to be the liberal lane of muddying the waters of what national health insurance is. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about how they do this with some help from Richard Eskow at Alternet. This is a couple because they state their claim in terms of quote-unquote principles, which of course mean nothing when we're talking about full, clear delivery. This is one of their principles. All Americans should have access to a regular source of care for themselves and their families. And Eskow writes in Alternet, why a quote-unquote regular source of care? Why not say that everyone should have access to quality care regardless of financial circumstances? Or why not use the centrist rhetoric of previous years and promise universal coverage? Perfect questions. No one should face, this is back to United States of Care, no one should face financial devastation due to illness or injury. This even avoids that standard issue centrist word, affordable. The word, quote-unquote, devastation suggests a very low level of financial protection at a time when increasing numbers of Americans report putting off needed medical care because of cost. We saw the tragedy of that teacher who died of the flu recently, putting off a copay to get the medication she needed. So-called catastrophic insurance plans would arguably fit this criteria, and they are disastrous for working families. Even Donald Trump's health insurance proposal, flimsy as it was, could conceivably fit the bill. And then this is the last. We need to achieve these goals through policies that are fiscally responsible and have the political support to last. Why we need single payer, no bullshit, which is my editorial there. Of course, that's more sort of meaningless buzzwords from this United States of Care group. And you're going to see celebrities and you're going to see centrist pundits go out and use this group to muddy the water. They might have good intentions. They might be operating under a delusional framework that we somehow can make some type of peace and reconciliation with the modern Republican Party, which is, of course, in its end game right now of its commitment, full and total commitment to utterly obliterating what little remains of the American social safety net, let alone expanding it. Let's be very clear about that. So this is going to become the next litmus test for every single mainline Democratic politician. When they say they support universal health care or single payer or Medicare for all, because these are the terms now, you need to say, do you support Bernie Sanders' bill? If you co-sponsored it, if you're Christian Gillibrand, if you're Kamala Harris, are you going to fulfill that as president? Now, of course, I don't trust any of these figures. The only one I trust on healthcare is Bernie Sanders. But we need to box them in on the specifics. That is the next road here. And No grassroots organization now can be compromised by the money that is undoubtedly going to be floating around to broaden the AstroTurf campaigns. There's consulting firms in Washington. There's strategy groups that specifically work to distort left and progressive messages and use formerly credible messengers. Howard Dean has pretty much blown his brand, but I wouldn't be surprised if he still gets some pharma and insurance money to help distort this debate. Other 2 quick points. Single payer is the only solution. It's already a compromise. The real left position would be an American national health insurance system with no private sector activity, except for potentially in areas of research and innovation. Single payer is the compromise, and that is the bare minimum of the tip of the spear we need for a broader mass movement of economic justice in this country. And finally, this is also why we do need Marx and we need a deeper radicalism. Because in today's world, with capitalism where it is, in terms of like very few additional places to grow, there's a couple of growth markets in the African continent. There's space in the realm of the immaterial economy, which is still rooted in material realities, right? The knowledge economy is still built on the hardware of all of these machines, which are still incredibly environmentally devastating and still rely, obviously, on the traditional patterns of consumption and all of the inequalities of money and access apply to who even gets the hardware. So we have one economy, the make-believe internet economy, which we get to set the rules of. We could easily turn into a commons and decentralize that in no way needs to rely on the handful of a couple of monopolies and behemoths attempting to turn it into sort of interactive cable with a lot of porn. That's totally unnecessary. Then we have an eco-economy which is reaching its absolute limit, but capitalism will never stop eating because as long as the engine is in place, it will eat through all of life's systems. And we're seeing that now. Everything from mineral extraction to, of course, devastating global climate change. In that context, of course, we're not going to be accelerationists. We're not going to be dumb. We're going to fight for the gains we need in the present system. Things like single-payer healthcare, things like an economic bill of rights, things like free public college. But we also have to know that as long as we're playing within the rules of capital, even if we achieve those things, as profoundly hard as they would be, they will never be stable or safe. So we always need a fuller on questioning and practices and economic alternatives and economic democratization in order to even allow for the types of adjustments in a more social democratic direction that most of us are actually practically talking about. So you need to expose the AstroTurf, fight for the social democracy, and hold the long-term future out of radically democratizing our economy to even have the possibility of those social democratic gains, and in the long run, to seriously fundamentally reorient the operating systems of society so we can protect the living systems of the planet and actually fulfill broad individual and group potential. That's the path. That's how it goes. And it should start this beautiful, large, macro, cosmic journey should start with you tweeting at United States of Care and every celebrity associated with it to go fuck themselves. They are the anti-shout-out. That really is just like a really sad conglomeration of like, it's like the perfect fusion of like predators and naive jackasses coming together to muddy the waters on one of the greatest areas of at least public opinion advancement we've had in modern American politics.
Andy Richter being part of the rollout for that really depresses me. Like, not that I expect better of celebrities. I just think like it just shows.
You were saying about Andy Richter?
How they can get swept up in these things.
Aw. Did you like Andy Richter, Matt?
I'm just thinking if we should do this someday. Rank the celeb resistors. Like, I think Ruffalo's maybe
He's up there. Ruffalo's cool though.
some of the Bernie
Ruffalo,
people
I
are
feel like
good,
Ruffalo
yeah.
knows what he's talking about.
Right, and then there's other people who are just horrible.
Name one more name besides Richter as another horrible resistor, guys. Horrible celebrity resistor. Lightning round.
I mean, there are.
Well, obviously there's Patricia Arquette.
Oh yeah, I forgot about it.
I mean, that's a pretty bad one right there. And then whoever the Trump administration fires next week, that all of a sudden all these jackasses try to embrace.
John Cusack's a bit Russia story.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah.
surprising.
I think so. I might be wrong about that.
Oh, yeah, you should totally just slander John Cusack on the show without knowing him, man. Well done.
Well, 1408's a great movie.
Good recovery. All right, so now we're going to do the shout out. And, oh, wow. What was it that Felix and I were talking about last week? Like the videos where they're like, the government's like, Birdman, Lil Wayne.
Don't let them get on the same track.
They can't get on the same track. It's going to be too good. Gotta intercept them. So the shout out does go to the African National Congress under its new leadership of Cyril Ramaphosa. They recalled Jacob Zuma today as head of the African National Congress. Cyril Ramaphosa had already been set to replace Zuma heading into the elections in 2019, but they've actually asked Zuma to leave earlier. There'll probably be a caretaker president. Look, America is really lucky that Donald Trump is not remotely as intelligent or as effective or as skillful as Jacob Zuma. The type of next advance of crony predator capitalism, Zuma and a network of intelligence officials and corporate raiders have really arranged in South Africa. They have eaten away at the state and not, of course, achieved or attempted to tackle. You can keep the music going, actually. Any of the second wave of economic liberation. Now, this does not mean that the ANC is going to be returning to its mass democratic socialist roots. Cyril Ramaphosa is a billionaire. He has a very, very, very questionable record. Look up the Marikana massacre. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. But as noted on this program, this replacement is coming early, and this is a global signal that South Africa is returning to a responsible mode of economic governance. And these are the types of distinctions that we need to make, because we want to overturn all of these systems, but there is a distinction between unjust and problems innate in implementing capital reforms versus full state robbery, which we saw under Jacob Zuma. So hopefully some hope for South Africa and the African National Congress, which for all of its problems in governance is still one of the most fascinating, noble, and to learn from organizations in our modern history. Do we have good pitch music ready? I don't even remember what this is.
This is West Side Story, the game. I really like that
You're
album.
Totally a game guy.
That album's... Dre did his stuff on this album.
This is so Dre. We are at over 1,000 patrons. Played Wolfenstein earlier. This is how we grow. It's how we pay the bills. Next week, I should let everybody know, we're actually not going to have a live show next week. This is going to be the first week we haven't had a live show since we've launched. We are on vacation, but we're releasing 2 illicit histories next week. One for the public audience, and of course, as always, the additional content for patrons. Thanks, everybody. It's a really good show. The word is spreading. We're giving history, we're giving context, we're giving the sort of larger infrastructure for understanding the moment we're in.
More and more people are saying.
More and more people are saying it everywhere. Including, I was just talking to Zero Books, and they just can't believe how great the show was. Before Matt rudely turned that into a Trump bit. It is actually really true. No. Thanks, all of you. The mission is clear. We're on it. We're already thinking about our next goal when we reach 2,000, the next gift that we'll give everybody. Illicit History is coming up on gamer identity, Marxist critique of the Gotha program, and the history of and creation of Islamophobia as foreign policy practice. All that much, much more. Patreon.com/TMBS. We're also at about 211 reviews on iTunes. Thank you. That does help sort of move the word if you have time to throw us one of those. And soon in the works, the main show, the main live full Michael Brooks show will still be on the Majority Report YouTube channel and still some of the clips, but we're going to actually have our own channel where we're going to be doing some clipping on as well. And that will help you spread the word in the sketches. I'm talking with the animator tomorrow. That's happening. Let's keep growing. Let's keep moving. You all are great. Thanks, everybody. Patreon.com/TMBS. We will be right back with Natalie from ContraPoint. Welcome back, Michael Brooks Show. I am Michael Brooks. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Joining us now is Natalie from ContraPoint. Natalie, how you doing?
Hi, I'm doing good. Thanks. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I appreciate your time as always. Let's talk about the conundrum that is Jordan B. Peterson.
Ah, yes.
Jordan,
yes.
our old friend.
Sweet Jordan, yeah.
Well, Jordan is very upset. Very,
yeah,
no, go ahead.
He's had a hard time being a public celebrity intellectual.
Right. I have a massive Patreon account, and all I do is freak out on camera and get interviewed everywhere. It's a very hard road.
It's a pretty good gig he has. Like, he complains about political correctness and gets an outrageous internet salary.
Believe me,
his academic gig.
Believe me, I have noted with care how good a gig that is.
I wish I had thought of this.
Yeah, exactly. What are we doing? We should be like,
Yeah.
Hey, actually, let's test that out for a second. Do you just feel like in today's world, you just like can't say what you're thinking anymore?
Yeah, it's like these politically correct liberals. Like, it's like Orwell's nightmare.
I know. It was like, I was just like thinking the other day, like I don't know, like I don't want to kill anybody or anything, but like gay people are gross, and like I can't say that anymore.
It's really terrible what this country's come to.
And meanwhile, that's like what the Muslims want.
We have women at schools. Yeah, I don't know.
Should they come to school? That'd be nice. All right. This is a very fat target here, but I'm just going to play. I'm sure you've seen this. I'm sure many people have already seen this. But we're going to play this clip. And actually, I have some critiques of how the Vice interviewer handled this, actually. But let's just play this clip to set you up of Jordan Peterson's conversation with Vice, where he explains just the really pernicious effects of makeup in the workplace, and then you can take it from there.
Here's a question. Can men and women work together in the workplace?
Yes, I do it.
How do you know?
Because I work with a lot of women.
Right. Well, it's been happening for, 40 years? And things are deteriorating very rapidly at the moment in terms of the relationships between men and women. Is there sexual harassment in the workplace? Yes. Should it stop? That'd be good. Will it? Well, not at the moment, it won't, because we don't know what the rules are.
Do you think men and women can work in the workplace together?
I don't know.
Without sexual harassment?
We'll see.
We'll see. How many years will it take for men and women working in the workplace together?
More than 40.
To get a sense.
We don't know what the rules are. Like, what? Here's a rule. How about no makeup in the workplace?
Why would that be a rule?
Why should you wear makeup in the workplace? Isn't that sexually provocative?
No.
It's not?
No.
Well, what is it then? What's the purpose of makeup?
Some people would like to just put on makeup.
Why?
I don't know why.
Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. That's why.
Boom.
Why do you put rouge on your cheeks? Same reason.
I mean, look.
How about high heels?
What are they
for?
about high heels?
What about them?
What about them?
They're there to exaggerate sexual attractiveness. That's what high heels do. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use sexual displays in the workplace. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that that is what they're doing. And that is what they're doing.
Do you feel like a serious woman who does not want sexual harassment in the workplace, do you feel like if she wears makeup in the workplace that she is somewhat being critical?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do think that.
Natalie, I'm going to throw to you in a second, but I do want to just acknowledge in transparency for the audience, for some really bizarre reason, that all the stuff that Jordan just said really closely mirrors recent commentary I had on a Tinder date. So that's very odd. I'm just kidding. Okay, go ahead. Take it from there.
I think that it's just typical of the kind of it's we've complained about this before, this reactionary tendency to renegotiate what are closed questions. Right. Like, we all know that men and women can get along in the same workplace, like as much as anyone can get along in the same workplace. Like, this is a question that was solved in the 1960s and 70s, like, right. To be reopening this conversation, there's a recent scandal involving men in Hollywood, sexually harassing women. And it's like, does this prove that actually the whole experiment of the 1960s was false and that we need to go back to women in the home? Like, I'm sure he's going to deny that that's what he's saying, but it seems to be the implication. I mean, if women and men cannot work together, like, what is he getting at? Mm-hmm. It's, it is like dragging up these old debates about, shouldn't we really be using gay conversion therapy, or dragging up old debates about, was Hitler really so bad? Or like, right. I mean, that's an extreme, but like, the tendency is it's always just asking questions, right? But asking a question to which the answer is something that we have pretty much settled as a society, and where to ask it again is to put up for debate again the basic rights of some group of people, in this case, women.
Do you think, because what the Vice reporter is doing there, though, is, and I noticed this because I agree with you 100%, and there's a lot of content that I do, like, I just did a deep dive for patrons on Charles Murray. As far as I'm concerned, Charles Murray was safely debunked and set aside, like, when we were kids in the 90s, right? But he isn't. He's back in the, like it or not, he's back in place, so we must address it. But I think that the other flaw in that clip is that they also seize on things that are sort of very, 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 very basic truisms and then draw demented conclusions. But the problem is because of maybe that right impulse that we have to dismiss the absurdity of it. So the Vice guy there is saying, like, what are you talking about, makeup? And he's saying, isn't makeup there to make you attractive? And my fear is that there is a market that he's speaking to, specifically of young men, that will watch that exchange and be like, well, wait a second, that he's making an obvious statement. Now, instead of saying like, right, like, and so is wearing a tie, and so is like everything. So what do you mean? Like, walk around naked? Like, what are you talking about? But instead, he's scoffing at what actually is kind of an obvious point that he's making with a demented purpose. And does that make sense? It's kind of the verbal game.
Yeah, it's kind of a clever little rhetorical trick, right? Like, you move from a very controversial hypothesis, the idea that men and women can't work together, and then you provide a supporting evidence, a very uncontroversial thing. Oh, well, don't women wear makeup to be attractive? And then you suddenly feel like you have to disagree with this obvious thing in order to disagree with the controversial thing. And it puts it, unless you're very fast on your feet, it's you end up looking very awkward.
Yeah, and then I'm afraid we are too often, because I think that sort of Vice stance, which I admit I do plenty of, but I'm having to self-interrogate a little bit. But I think a little bit of that sort of like, really? Like, that's not cool anymore. Like, it for better and for worse, I think there is this certain hunt for sincerity. And particularly these kind of like substitute father figures that tell you the answer to everything. Substitute father figure.
Yeah, that is kind of what it is. then the notion that he's telling it like it is. There's a kind of like preference, I guess, for the kind of statement or the kind of truth that seems like it's too dangerous to say or something. Now, I think that women wear makeup to be attractive is probably not too dangerous to say.
Right.
But because of the way he frames it, it kind of has that feel to it. And I think a lot of people are attracted to that feeling because they feel personally that they're stifled and unable to say things that they believe, usually because they're very ignorant things, but things that they may not understand why.
I want to get, we'll use as a bridge Peterson's sort of, we have this ridiculous, nonsense. Because, yes, and of course the bigger context here is he's saying, yes, I would say he's making a truism statement about makeup, which you could just easily say that human beings of every kind enhance their appearance in many contexts. I mean, this is like nothing. And also attractiveness and appearance could...
Why do men shave? Why do it's just very boring.
Yeah, and by the same you're a nice looking young man that'll help you in this job interview. I mean, even that has been right. Like that. This is just a totally generic nothing comment. But I think when you deny the truth of it, you actually add more credence to the demented point he's making, which is that the conclusion of like sexual abuse by men of power, the lesson is that girls shouldn't work anymore, which is a demented conclusion.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I mean, and the point is even like it relies on this conflation between wanting to be attractive in some broad sense and like wanting specifically to be sexually attractive to your boss, which I think doesn't follow.
Right. That's exactly right. That's another distinction. We're going to get specifically into his comment on gender identity and some of your recent work, but I do think though I didn't use that sort of father figure thing as an insult. I mean, I think one of the reasons that Jordan Peterson fascinates me, and I hope that I can do, I've done a lot of work around Sam Harris, and I think I have convinced some people of the real sort of fundamental flaws in his worldview. But I also think that, at least for me, if I was to self-interrogate, I was too glib about disregarding the traits that people are looking for that he provides them, if that makes sense. And I think in Jordan Peterson's case, and I want your thoughts on this, there is this... I think of someone like Christopher Ryan, who I've had on, who talks about, hunter-gatherer societies and sort of like, and we don't need to gender it, but it does seem to be a thing of young men a lot, but like lack of sense of place and lack of sense of purpose, which I think affects all of us in our economic environment and our present social conditions. But that somehow this, I'm trying to distill it, but it's like sort of authority, self-help, and then it's sort of slid into this broader container of reactionary politics. And that's a very noxious brew, because I think for some people, yes, he's getting them at the I don't like trans people, I don't like gay people, blah, 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 PC stuff. But that's actually not that new. What's new is how it connects with here's your map to living a better and more meaningful life. And that's very potent terrain for people, because that's really what most people are, looking for, in fact.
Yeah, so that's clearly part of the appeal. Like, it would be such a misrepresentation, right, to say that Jordan Peterson is just like pushing bigotry or something like that, because he's not just doing that. Like, he's offering this kind of guidance, right? I think I don't scoff at your father figure comparison. I mean, I think that, as you say, everyone feels like a little bit lost, and that includes young white men, they do need someone.
That's right.
They're going to look to someone for guidance, and Peterson, like, I don't even think he's an especially vicious bigot, but part of the way that he appeals to people is through these kind of easy, available prejudices that sort of bring people in. But then if you look at the actual like wisdom he's dispensing, it's pretty boring social conservatism, like makeup in the workplace and this kind of thing. Like the problem is he's a wrong role model, but he nonetheless has effectively gotten himself in that position.
Let's get to his sort of comments on gender and transgender identity.
Yeah.
And then maybe related. You've done some. I really like your videos because and I feel like it's parallel to the illicit history work that I do. That you try to unwind ideas through tracing them back to the source. So maybe talk about Peterson on gender specifically, and then we can get to some of your recent work sort of debunking specific myths about gender identity with trans people specifically.
Yeah, so Peterson, I mean, he first got a big national stage when he sort of took the stand saying that he would refuse to, use or if he would refuse to be compelled, I suppose, to use non-binary pronouns if such a rule were implemented on campus. And this just took off. The usual kind of campus social justice warriors are against free speech story was told.
Right.
And he became this kind of big celebrity all over North America. And I think that, he may not himself be a terrible transphobe. I mean, but this idea of his, this rhetorical move that he made, where you sort of frame opposition to some particular trans issue as an issue of the rest of us defending our free speech or something like that, that was just turned out to be brilliant. And bigots have jumped all over that. It's extremely useful to them, even if it's, something say they share with people who aren't intensely bigoted. But that's exactly the most useful thing for bigots to have, is a common talking point with people who aren't intensely bigoted. And that, so it's kind of a phony issue, though, because it often relies on this assumption that trans people are trying to make it illegal to misgender them or something like that, or that people are going to be thrown in jail for refusing to use they, them pronouns. It's just a massive uproar about a thing that just doesn't happen. And, I assure people all the time, like, I really don't think people should go to jail for misgendering someone. But then I'm always assured in response that, but the trans agenda, like, they want that. Like, there's lots of people who want that. And I'm like, are there? I don't know. It's interesting. You can seem to be able to create these kind of free speech scares out of almost nothing.
Right. I have never, and granted this is anecdotal, I have not heard a single trans person ever advocate for the jailing of misgendering. I've never heard
this either. I've never heard this either.
I have never heard that in the existence. And I think even like the strongest cases that they have come down to like these students somewhere were being obnoxious or simplistic. Like, wow, what a fucking shock that a college student might be obnoxious or simplistic.
Right.
Like, we're going to get to a Turning Points USA story later. I can assure you that this is not on a political axis. But my final question with Peterson, though, do you think it's strategic? So I think, like, okay, at least the way I would define a form of bigotry, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm in a way not particularly focused on people's personal attitudes in a certain sense, but I'm very interested in their sort of performativity. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're willing to leverage that sentiment to advance your agenda, then you absolutely are engaging in a form of bigotry, whether or not that sort of personally applies to you. So I think it's fair to use that word for him. But what I wonder is that because he's very scrupulous about sort of, I mean, he's certainly said, I mean, now as his sort of media exposure comes out, I think he is saying sort of some more kind of crazy things.
Yeah, he's going deeper into the hole, I think.
Yeah, he's going deeper into the hole. But if we took him before he went deeper in the hole, and I'm also thinking of a guy like Sam Harris, who it's like, look, if we did any actual real world reading of this stuff, the implications for Muslims are not positive. That's a very safe statement, unless you're just in, deluded Platonic ideal realm. But he put so much groundwork into protecting himself from certain charges, even if you might think, or I might think, that they're disingenuous, that he created a lot of room for saying, like, look, these people just throw the word bigot at anybody. And I'm wondering, in the Peterson case, I think we can agree that the performance is bigoted, but because he's done so much to that happened in the interview in the UK. The woman accused, she brought up this example of in his classroom, and he said, well, actually, I have never not personally respected somebody's gender preference.
Yeah.
I just have a problem with the regulation, which is a brilliant move. Because
it is brilliant, yeah.
So how to deal with that? I mean, should we still just bulldoze ahead and say, this is what you are, or do we have to get more sly like him?
Well, it's a point that I find very exasperating. And I mean, you notice that when I summarized this a second ago, I sort of took care to not say that he was a bigot,
right,
but that he was sort of being useful to bigots. One of the reasons I said that, I mean, I of course agree with you that insofar as he's behaving publicly, he may as well be behaving as a bigot.
Right.
But, this defense that they have, well, Peterson's, well, I would never misgender a trans person, of course. I'm simply insisting upon my right to, or someone's right to. It makes it very difficult to object because, if you call him a bigot, then they can just trot out his response saying that, oh, well, I never do this. I mean, so my personal method of dealing with this, I don't have a definite answer. What I have been doing is I try to avoid calling figures when I'm doing call-outs. I try to avoid calling them a bigot or a transphobe or a racist or whatever it is in that kind of, slapping a noun on them kind of way. Mm-hmm. Instead, I will describe their behavior as transphobic or describe their behavior as racist or bigoted. And that, I think it helps sort of lessen that defensiveness, or at least it removes the ability of them to offer this kind of personal stuff like, oh, my best friend is black, therefore, like, okay, I don't care who your best friend is because what you did was still racist. I think that is sort of helps, but I haven't quite completely figured it out.
No, I think that's actually very helpful. I think that and that's just tighter ground, because then you could say, like, look, the implications and the performance. Yeah, I think that's great. You've done some recent work. You did a video recently specifically dealing with some of the sort of academics behind some of the sort of, if we were kind of unpacking the sort of origin story of modern sort of transphobia, it would go back to them. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the video specifically deals with, I don't want to get too arcane with this, but it's about Blanchard's theory about what trans people are. And it's a theory that supports the idea that basically being transgender is a sexual paraphilia of some kind, which is, it's an idea that's pretty common, right? Like a lot of people believe, they've probably never heard the word Blanchard's theory, but they believe that trans people are sort of fetishists or something like that. So yeah, they're... Oftentimes you have, the prejudice predates the science, I think, in this case. I didn't dwell on that too much in this video, but I think that the science, sort of picks up on popular attitudes, especially when it comes to attitudes of an outsider looking at a group of people who aren't allowed to represent themselves or who are sort of denied a voice and instead given an authoritative voice coming from a scientist, but an authoritative voice who's essentially giving a formal expression of what is a sort of commonplace prejudice.
And so who were these people? I mean, briefly, and where is the state of that sort of science now? And the only thing I'll tag on to that too is that is this also a good reminder that certainly science, anything outside of sort of like really, 2 + 2 = 4, which isn't even science, right? It's mathematics. Like, we have to remember how contextual this stuff is.
Yeah, I think it's especially too when it comes to psychological science or social science, which if it thinks of itself as being sort of too... I agree that if it removes context from itself, it sort of loses sight of what it's actually studying. But I think that in this case, we're talking about, a few cis male psychologists, J. Michael Bailey, who is a psychologist at Northwestern, Ray Blanchard, who is a sexologist at Toronto, and Blanchard came up with this theory. Bailey popularized it in a pop science book. And it really hasn't had that much science impact. It hasn't had much impact within medical practice. There's been some therapists who've used this, usually to the detriment of trans people.
I would imagine so.
But it is mostly excluded from the contemporary like medical discussion of trans people. However, it's been adopted by, people we call TERFs on the internet. It's been, trotted out anytime.
What does TERF stand for?
Trans exclusive radical feminist.
Exclusive. Okay.
Yeah. So this refers to a person who uses a kind of veneer of radical feminism to justify transphobic attitudes.
Okay.
And this autogynephilia theory, Ray Blanchard's typology of trans people, is very popular with them, although it describes the experience of very few trans people.
And he just, I'm assuming like this work was essentially like, he didn't do much actual, what's his sort of stated methodology?
Yeah, I mean, Blanchard has a few empirical studies which upon attempts to replicate them, have shown that his findings are much less pronounced than he originally found them, and which, lack certain obvious things. Like he's trying to demonstrate, for instance, that bisexual trans women are not truly bisexual, and he only compares them to gay men. He doesn't compare them to cis women, things like that. But Bailey, the person who popularized this idea, really this is simply based on analysis of case studies. So with Bailey, it comes to just literally just going to gay bars, talking to trans women, and then forming these like hunches about them. Often,
I'm forming hunches about Bailey.
Yeah, I have some hunches too, but he. I mean, when the book came out, many of the trans women who he had interviewed were like horrified by being misrepresented in this way. Right. So that's, you would think, a bad sign, but there's a kind of there's an attitude among some of these scientists that like, oh, we don't actually need to listen to the people we're writing about because we know better.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that people watch that and all of your videos. I have a final question for you. It's a pleasure as always. This is broad, but I just want to sort of lay the land. I mean, YouTube is a relatively right-wing space, it feels like.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a continuum of, obviously, me and Majority Report, Young Turks. I mean, there's some sort of, ecosystem of kind of lefty talkers. And in fact, a lot of us are, in fact, straight, cis, white dudes. So we still get, there'll be Jordan Peterson comments on this video, right?
Yeah,
because
sure.
it's in the title.
Of course.
I guess not. I don't want to. I mean, if you want to. I mean, I have no doubt there's all sorts of disgusting feedback to your work, and that's part of this ecosystem. But I guess I'm more curious if you have it on the positive end. I mean, are you experiencing? I mean, a lot of people are watching your videos. A lot of people are out. Like, are you experiencing persuasion or intervention, or at the very least, people entertaining a broader perspective than they had before and getting that kind of feedback as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, actually, I receive really a lot of very positive feedback, including some of, this is the stuff I really treasure, people saying that, they were sort of teetering on the brink of the alt-right for a while, but after, thinking about things more deeply and exposing themselves to some new ideas, including my videos, they were sort of able to, realize that was not the road to go down, and that they had been sort of misled by these seductive talking points about political correctness or whatever. And that to me is very encouraging. I feel like what I'm doing and the way I'm doing it does work. I'm reluctant to talk about that too much because I don't want to seem like I'm bragging about how great I am at it. But like, I think that simply having people here and having people doing the work of like calmly explaining this stuff in a way that is sort of accessible to people who may not already be insiders, absolutely works. It's absolutely worth doing. And my experience has been in many ways very positive with it.
And there is a sort of hip hop thread that weaves through this show. So you should definitely take your appearances here to brag and, be incredibly cocky about what you're doing.
Okay, noted.
Yeah. That's that. Save humility for other outlets. Anyway. Anybody who watches me could tell you. Natalie, I really appreciate your time as always. ContraPoint, everybody check it out. Brilliant work.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks so much for having me on again.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay, everybody, here is what we're going to do. We are going to, well, actually, I think we're going to get to the pyramid. I think it's pyramid time. I am just getting the pyramid now. Is it highlighted?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. So, like, I'm going to contradict my own advice here, and I'm going to get back to a certain lack of empathy. There are certain people that if somebody comes up to you, whether it be at a party, whether it be on social media, it doesn't matter where. And if they say, one of the following people is really cool, I just have a reaction. So one, I'm not going to lie, Sam Harris. Still a very tough road for me. I don't get it. Drake. And this applies to some of my best friends. I love Waz, but Drake, like if we're talking about best rappers and Drake is the first one to come up, I mean,
diplomatic community is good.
It is very, very good. And this guy, Elon Musk, who is like, first of all, he's a glorified government, there's nothing worse. People go, this guy's like Tony Stark in real life. It's like, first of all, if you're an adult, you shouldn't be talking about, comic book people in real life. I'm sorry. Okay? I apologize. I did an hour of Wolfenstein or whatever earlier, so lay off me. I'm going to go back to my position of fantasizing about comic book characters in real life is a little bit problematic. Secondly, Tony Stark, is not without flaws, is how I'll put it diplomatically. He's a arms contractor and a trust fund baby, and he flies around the world intervening in a weapons suit. Now, some of those guerrilla groups that he's disrupting might be right. Okay, I'm not saying the Taliban, but I don't know wherever else he went. What if Tony Stark bothered the Zapatistas? Okay? You need to have a little bit more of a critical perspective on Tony Stark people. Even if that is a ghost-faced synonym. So Elon Musk, but what Elon Musk really, though, he's just a glorified government contractor. He's part of this, he's a PayPal mafia guy, right?
He is.
So he's another one.
With Elon Musk.
Jesus. No, along
and
with
Reed Hastings.
You mean along with Peter Thiel?
With Peter Thiel, yeah.
Yeah. Made a lot of money from that. Nice doing business with all of you.
This is something nobody would have invented if we didn't get to it first.
Yeah, if we didn't get to it first. It's called early adopter advantage. Sorry. Maybe it's called I'm a genius advantage. You're only good for your blood. So it's part of these pricks that and now, he does all this stuff with Tesla, and he shoots it. What did he do? He shot a rocket with his car. I mean,
look, the rockets are cool enough.
The rockets are cool enough, but the just pathological need to have somebody fulfill this role of being like entrepreneur, spaceman, explorer for a guy who got rich off of a pay exchange, off of a money transferring program, and now essentially does government contracts and designed a cool car for the 1%. That's it. And he also has rockets. But there's another thing about him, which is that there's incredibly abusive labor conditions at his Tesla factory. There have been reports and complaints from workers at various parts of his enterprise that I've noticed for a while. And I'm just going to read one example from this piece in BuzzFeed. In December 2014, OSHA was called following a particularly gruesome accident. According to publicly available documents prepared by the state health and safety inspectors, a Tesla technician named Paul Lewis had been instructed to dust an electrical panel. Lewis's supervisor warned the team at lunch that the power to the panel would be turned back on. After having been off that morning, but in the noise of the break area, Lewis and his colleagues didn't hear the warning. When Lewis's feather duster touched the powerful bars inside the electric panel, it exploded, creating a flash that knocked him off his feet. He was on his back, a witness told Cal OSHA during an investigation prompted by the incident. His eyes were closed. He had bleeding from his mouth and nose. His arms were burned. His vest was melted. There was a puddle of blood underneath his head. Jesus Christ. Witnesses said that when Lewis regained his consciousness, he didn't know his name. Tesla ultimately was charged with 4 serious safety failings, among other things, to ensure that only qualified electrical workers worked on the panels and prevailing to provide adequate training and instruction. Ultimately, Tesla was required to pay $40,400 fines to Cal OSHA. Yeah, that's really going to cut into them. And there's a variety of other complaints about underpay, workplace violations, lack of safety. And also, Elon Musk's, look up his comments about black employees. There was a very odd story about that a couple of months ago. Look up his general attitudes towards cafeteria workers and labor unions. And this whole Silicon Valley ethos is absolutely vicious with regards to labor. Going even back to the cartel that Steve Jobs and Lucas and the Google guys were part of to suppress the wages of tech engineers, people at the high end of these jobs. Yes?
A couple points on this. One,
yes, please. And maybe we get the music rolling while you make these points.
Yeah. One is I'm a big fan of rockets as the next guy. But the problem is, like, first of all, we shouldn't really give. The problem is how much credit we give the individual here. Like,
yes,
I'm cool watching those rockets float down to space. That's pretty neat
cool
stuff.
It's cool.
It would be more impressive if he wasn't like a
government subsidized libertarian douchebag,
or if he was doing it with good workplace conditions,
or if he was doing it with good workplace conditions.
Second of all, like, even if he was doing all this with good workplace conditions and there was nothing to criticize Elon on personally, the idea that there's only like a few Elons and we have how many billionaires on the planet, like, every one of these people should be doing this sort of stuff, like deigning to do something for the public benefit. But instead, when one of them do it, we just see like, oh, it's worth it to let people be this grotesquely rich. But
it's
most
the
of them
absolute
don't use
bare
it for that.
minimum of acceptable behavior.
Like, you better
to have money that nobody should be allowed to have.
Yeah, if you're sitting
shoot rockets
and
out
not
in space.
doing anything like this, then we have a real problem.
Yeah,
like, you're doing the basic bare minimum. What you're doing,
you should be shooting rockets into space or designing shirts like Wyatt. God damn it!
And also,
Grisham.
Elon has like a really incredible ability to like forego public scorn for his billions of dollars. I remember after, the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, he had offered to build a small solar power grid in Puerto Rico as part, and everyone was like, "Oh, Elon Musk, this wonderful philanthropist." No, he was trying to make a bid for the $5 billion contract to rebuild Puerto Rico's electrical system.
Right.
This guy's acting under the same pretenses as any other, venture capitalist in the area. But for some reason, he gets praised for this. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Because he gets credit for the absolute obvious. He's a vulture. And also, if you are standing on him, it's pretty much, you've told on yourself. You're lame. Elon Musk, 2. The motherfucking pyramid. Goodbye, sir. Try to rocket your way out of being kept in an Egyptian dungeon where grain was stored. I think we have a few minutes for Brie. Let's do this Russell Brand, Sam Harris thing. This is going to be the comments on this video. I pretty much never read YouTube comments, but this actually no. I'm going to tell myself I always read YouTube comments on try to respond and engage on Michael Brooks shows. But between like Jordan Peterson and now if we include a couple of bars at Harris, this is going to be like the aneurysm of Virgin's comment board par excellence. I almost feel like we should just like include a door barb in there just to like get a trifecta. And it's always interesting because like I like the continuum. Like with Peterson's people on Twitter or whatever, it's always like, you have failed to understand the profundity of his Jungian social Darwinism, and you are part of the pronoun brigade that is failing the world. And then Harris's people are like, You've acted in bad faith, Muslims. And then they tweet you, Sam Harris's thought experiments, as if you've never heard them before and they made them up, which actually is unethical. You shouldn't be stealing Sam's thought experiments without crediting and bothering people on Twitter with them. No, I thought this was really interesting. Sam Harris was on Russell Brand's show. I'm a big fan of Russell Brand. And, you know, there's one thing in here that I actually disagree with Brand with that I think we can position differently. But it was great. I mean, Russell Brand treated him very, very respectfully. As with most of these conversations, I don't know how much happened. I think everybody left. You know, the Harris people left thinking, you know, there's clear thinking and Brand's a postmodernist, and the Brand people thought.
I saw one video that Sam Harris schools Russell Brand on consciousness, and I'm like, I listened to that whole thing, and I didn't really hear that.
Yeah, but right. I listened to it, and I heard, like, you know, funny Messiah complex guy attempts to get Sam Harris to become more fully human. But let's play this clip. It's worth checking out how Brand handled this.
My general feeling is that the Quran wholly is like most religious scripture. The intention is to create a social environment where people are benevolent and cohesive, which ultimately became a tool for social control as a result of the way that power structures.
But there's more to that. There's life
within
after death.
religion
There's
and politics. But I don't know. I think again that, but like, I wouldn't deliberately misread the metaphor. For me, life after death, and this is a person that spent 2 years in a silent retreat, I would gather you would dig this, is that beyond the life that is determined by primal desires and biographical wants and your imagination of yourself, there is a life after the death of that individual. After that individual dies and you recognise that the temporal can never provide fulfilment, you gain access to a sort of a second life, an afterlife. The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth and man sees it not. The kingdom of heaven
Are
is
you talking
within.
about the life after the death of your ego?
I suppose so, Sam. Yes, I would say I would imagine, like, if it's not talking about that, I don't know what it's talking about. You know, and what the value of that would be.
But that's fine. But
as a manual for being human. Also, Sam, there's so much, mate. Let me hold on a sec. So we've got to go through. You did a big classification system of the degrees of who's the worst madman.
I just want to put a flag right here.
We've got to do the schools.
Okay, well, we'll do that.
Do your flag, and then we're going back to the schools.
I just want to acknowledge that whatever
my personal reading,
whatever your reading is, most people most of the time think that the afterlife is a literal place you go after you die. That consciousness survives the death of the body. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition,
I know,
especially the Christian and the Islamic tradition, it really matters whether you believe the right thing or not. I mean, in fact, this life doesn't matter at all, and that's what's so corrosive about this belief system.
But like,
I just wanted to pause it there because that is bullshit. Like, I don't know where Sam Harris, like, what his spiritual life growing up was, but I remember when I was like hadn't become like agnostic atheist.
Right.
I did not feel that certain about heaven and hell at all. Like, I wondered about that privately, and like publicly I might say, yeah, I believe in heaven, but you never really it's never really that certain. I don't think.
Even the literal belief in those traditions is actually like this life is like almost like a testing or training ground that determines that. So there actually is a lot of weight put on that.
Really matters whether you believe the right thing or not. I mean, in fact, this life doesn't matter at all, and that's what's so corrosive about this belief system.
But like, you know, but let's look at some of the alternatives. Now, we just devised a barometer of degrees of madness and the worst types of madness and the worst way to have your kids murdered in a school by which particular type of madman. You know, but we should probably bring into the mix, from the sky by a drone. Because for me, like, I don't want my kids killed in a school for any ideology, whether it's grounded in sort of rationalism and economics, or whether it's a book that's a bit older and more, I don't know, esoteric or colourful or imaginative. I don't know sort of how to determine it. But what I suppose the heart of what I want to get to is, whilst undoubtedly religion has been used to justify violence from all types of angles in different historical moments, and, you know, Buddhist violence in Burma and Christian violence in, you know, like in the Middle East, or secular violence underwritten by Christianity, resourced entirely from Christianity and sort of Christian dualistic notions, undertaken by far-right Christian presidents and whatever, or, you know, sort of the more lucid, livid and obvious and contemporaneous far-right extremist Islamic violence. It's like, how do we see that as distinct from rational violence, political violence, particularly when that is far more potent, far more widespread, and is, I would say, is the violence of the dominant culture. What interests me, Sam Harris, is power. And the powerful.
Okay.
And for me, I'm interested in who gets to decide who the other is, who gets to decide by what metric rationalism and religion is evaluated. And it seems to me that the kind of violence that's focused on in a lot of your work is the violence of desperate people, desperate and possibly subjugated people. And I would say to I know that you don't do this, but I want you to educate me on this. But to dismiss the colonial aspect, the sort of economic aspect, the occupation of Middle Eastern countries, the historical aspect. I mean, for me, it seems like how can you conduct that extraction? How can you divorce those different types of violence? They seem to me to be part of one narrative.
Well, I can do it very simply because you have just to dissect out the variable of colonialism or oppression from the outside. You have examples of people who have been oppressed, as oppressed as any other people who don't resort to this kind of violence because they don't have the same belief structure, right? So take that. Here's an almost perfect scientific experiment. You have Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims living in the same occupied territories, right? Now, who was before the Israelis put up the wall, who was blowing themselves up in pizza parlors and discotheques, right? It was 99.9% Muslim, right? It was not Christian.
Now, I don't know if Harris is doing this consciously to talk about modern intifada and the recent outbreak of terrorism. But if you look at even a broader historical context, the historical pioneer of Palestinian terror was a guy named George Habash, who was connected with Marxist-Leninist groups, Black September, and was in fact a Christian. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian and a Palestinian guerrilla movement leader, and absolutely we could fairly call him a terrorist because he did advocate targeting civilians. So even the Palestinian example is a lot more historically muddied than Harris would like to think. Now, we could go and point out all of the various sort of contradictions to this, right? There's the kamikaze pilots. There's the fact that the Tamil Tigers pioneered suicide bombing, so on and so forth. And this is where Harris really loses it, because you could still have a very conservative reading that was, still wanted to primarily place the blame elsewhere, not on U.S. or Western actions. If you go back to the 80s and the funding that the Pakistanis and the Saudis chose, and they chose to funnel into the most radical parts of the Mujahideen, there's a story in a book called Beating the Bear, which was written by a former Pakistani ISI official who helped run the Mujahideen for the Pakistani intelligence services. And they tell the story of a Mujahideen operation that the CIA and the Pakistanis wanted to do, where they would blow up a major bridge that was a vital link for Soviets running supplies into Afghanistan for their occupying forces. At this point in the 80s, essentially that operation, in order to do, would be, by necessity, be a suicide operation. In other words, if they sent two guys in there to blow up this tunnel, rather, it wasn't a bridge, it was a tunnel, to blow it up, they would die. Not necessarily like on purpose, like they wouldn't be strapped with explosives, but it was a suicide run. They couldn't get anybody to do it at this point because suicide missions were considered so haram by the Mujahideen. So you could say the rise of this as a political tactic is not only connected to the political conditions. I mean, Palestine is a really shaky example to use because that actually is where Pape's work on humiliation, which Harris totally dismisses and doesn't really understand, comes most into play, because that is a literal ongoing subjugation and humiliation of another people through occupation. But if you go into a broader context of how it accelerated in these Sunni groups, you could look at what the prime Sunni power chose to fund. They chose to fund the most right-wing reactionary forces, and that facilitated the most right-wing reactionary tactics. Do you think if a Somali Sufi group, as an example, moderate, in fact, mystical form of Islam that has been fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia, that along with other groups in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, if those more moderate forces and different types of guerrilla groups receive the vast bulk of funding and their tactics dominated, we wouldn't have a completely different geopolitical understanding of Islamic tactics. At another point in that interview, Harris said that essentially, and I'm going to paraphrase, but that ideas are sort of the most powerful. And I think that is a kind of actually really charmingly, unbelievably naive view of how the world works. Ideas are an after effect, and ideas are allowed to flourish when the context allows them to flourish. Sometimes that context is organic. I think there is a tremendous interest in things like Marxism now because of economic and material conditions. But there's also simply the reality that different systems allow for different ideologies to flourish at different times. And if you combine the failures of nationalist and left projects in the 70s, the rise of global religious fundamentalism filtered through things like Saudi and Pakistani foreign policy, you have a much better grip on why this current thing is manifesting. And by the way, we on our side can easily, and the last thing I'll say, I want you guys to jump in. The last thing I'll say is Russell Brand is totally right about this stuff, and we can easily in a conversation acknowledge obvious things like, yes, the Taliban was horrible to women. Yes, there is fundamentalist and fanatical religion and religious regimes that abuse people's rights across the globe. Yes, readings of Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism are toxic. And maybe even I would accept that probably Christianity, Islam, and Judaism might have more, they're less innately herbivorous than Buddhist or Jain doctrines, right? But if you don't historicize and you don't economize things, you're in a fantasy universe that leads either to a nice version that Harris criticizes, which is a sort of a sort of equal playing field where you're not making important distinctions, or in his case, where everything is these ahistorical quotes, which you can use to forward destructive and dangerous policy ideas, or at this point, it seems like since he primarily shies away from policy, just sort of hammering home the fact that he doesn't like Islam. The productivity of this for the broader debates about everything from human rights to migration to foreign policy to the evolving nature of democracy is utterly mystifying to me. Please jump in, guys.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that it's it's a really juvenile idealist belief that Harris advocates. Right. I mean that idealist in the fact that he thinks that like ideas, are driving the world rather than material conditions. Right. I mean, the end result of a lot of the arguments that Harris is making is that, if you just sent in, let's say, 200 22-year-olds fresh from college from America into Iran, it would fundamentally change the politics of that country. Right. It's like, no, Iran is the way that it is, and the Islamic Revolution happened there because of outside and interior like material issues. And it's this kind of idea that if we just critique Islam enough, that like the rest of the world is going to change or become this new thing. It's wrong, and it's naive, and it's ahistorical. Right. And it's incredible that somebody like Harris has been able to make a career based on this, because fundamentally, what he's trying to do is he's trying to bring up the terror and the horror of theocratic regimes as an excuse for the terror and the horror of capitalist, neoliberal, and imperialist regimes. So it's a really, what else can I say? He's a charlatan.
And don't come I've read the quotes. I've read the Quran. I studied Islam. Okay, I get it. You coming at me and saying you're ignoring the hadith and da da da. What you don't understand is you think that we're pre-Harris in sophistication. We're post. Okay, you're having a juvenile conversation. I'm trying to actually get to a point of understanding this stuff, not to be politically correct and nice to Muslims, blah, 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 though I don't think being...
That's all I'm in it for.
Yeah. I mean, God forbid having like civility and respect in general. The same thing that... And by the way, the last point I'll make, they talk about double standards that liberals have. I have the same argument about Christianity. I don't agree with blanking statements about Christianity. Christianity manifests in many, many different ways, depending on geopolitical, historical, social context, and has been a force for tremendous good. Tremendous good. And I don't appreciate lazy liberal categorizations about Christianity either. If you go to a more classical atheist tradition of like people who actually really read and understood this stuff, they understood, they might have been utterly appalled by all of the damage that religion has sort of inflicted on society, but they were sophisticated enough to know that it played a tremendously serious role. And if you really think that just being like 15 and discovering that a fairy tale isn't true is the be-all end-all of the game, I mean, okay, congratulations. Yes, creationism is not real. Nailed it. And people will watch this and they'll say, Russell Brand's being a relativist. Russell Brand he is the one, the dude with the Ganesha tattoo, my man meditating with the expanded global consciousness, is the one materializing the conversation and elevating it in a synchronized way.
I'd just like to play this one part over again, just because I think it points to something I think important.
Yeah, please.
Extremist Islamic violence. It's like, how do we see that as distinct from rational violence, political violence, particularly when that is far more potent, far more widespread, and is, I would say, is the violence of the dominant culture. What interests me, Sam Harris, is power and the powerful. Okay. And for me, I'm interested in who gets the...
Okay, so that that Sam Harris did when Russell Brand says he's interested in power, the thing Sam Harris likes to say about ideas is that they're powerful. So he's interested in how words are powerful, but he's not interested at all in actual power.
That there has never been an analysis that he has started. And that's why the other thing, too, in his sort of game to be aware of is that if you talk about just a basic asymmetry of power, so let's concede the United States, for all of its global crimes of empire, which I don't know if Harris is fully familiar with, but is real.
He says he knows about them, but
Okay, but whatever. I'll try to take him at his word. I can still say yes. There's no doubt that it is an on-the-ground experience. The barbarism of ISIS totally outweighs the United States. So the global crime toll of the United States is infinitely bigger than ISIS. On the ground, yes. U.S. troops, throwing people off buildings, burning people alive, raping children is not part of coin strategy, okay? We have evolved on some level, right? But the bigger structural reality is that ISIS is a speck compared to our presence in the world. So if you want to understand geopolitics, you have to go to the engines that are actually driving geopolitics. Harris's move then is he goes, okay, I understand that, but what if ISIS controlled the world? There's a thought experiment. And then you're off to the races in mental masturbation instead of reality discussion. It's very revealing. And I honestly mean this. If you're a fan of his and you have a resource that you could point me to correct me on this, I've searched far and wide for any type of sustained Harris commentary on the Iran nuclear deal, because that is the closest to a real-world non-thought experiment fantasy example of where all of this thinking, if we want to call it that, goes, which is that, okay, supposedly the Islamic Republic is this fanatic Muslim state, although it's really not. It's actually a very realist-oriented actor, if you understand it. But I'll even set that aside. Say it's a fundamentalist fanatic Muslim state. It has the ability technologically to acquire a nuclear weapon, which, as Sam Harris has said in one of his previous thought of experiments, might, and again, I'm sure out of context, but it might, I think we can at least fairly say might, it might justify a preemptive attack if an Islamic regime had that capacity because they're apocalyptic. So out of the realm of all of this verbiage and thought experimenting and divorce from politics, this is a real world example. This supposed serious hardcore Islamic state, which absolutely, by the way, if we're going to drag those other issues in, violates human rights at home, supports foreign policy goals that actually in Syria we're synchronized with in some ways, and other ways we don't like. That deal has worked 100%. There is no credible person, like no serious person in the realm, including people like Tillerson has been signing off on this and getting Trump to sign off on those reauthorizations every couple of months. There is nobody, and anybody in the policy apparatus who tries to undermine that deal tries to do it by doing side poison pills that aren't in the deal. There is no one in the policymaking world, in the energy world, who says that deal isn't happening. So, cool. I'll do a trade with Sam Harris. I will do one thought experiment for 3 actually occurring examples of things happening in the terrestrial plane that, by the way, don't just involve Palestinian suicide bombers or random examples of Islamic terrorism. I'm going to want 2 or 3 actual real-world occurring historical events and foreign policy challenges now. And actually, no, I'll be fair. I'll go 3 to 3, thought experiment-wise. But just notice that tactic. Okay, Sam, what does that mean for Iran? Well, say that the Iranians ran the world. No, they don't. I'm talking about this world. But what if the ISIS ran the world? No, I'm not talking about.
I'm just talking about ideas.
Yeah, right. One of the ideas that I think has a lot of power to change the world is that dealing with reality is a great way to deal with reality. That's one of my ideas that I believe in. You want to clean this up, Grisham?
But Michael, what if the Juggalos ran the world?
No, you'd be like, okay, yeah, okay, right, got it. But say that there were 2 people running in a parallel field, right? One of these people is running in Central Park. The other person is running in Kabul. Where would you rather be? Okay, I think I'd rather be in Central Park. What does that have to do with arming the Mujahideen, Sam? You're totally missing it. You're just doing political correctness. Oh, my God. All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break. And then the great, the wise, the Twitter provoking like a motherfucker, Michael Brooks Show crew, Briahna Joy Gray is here. We'll be right back on the Michael Brooks Show. you up. Oh, well, welcome back. Caught us in a little back scene prep there. Michael Brooks Show. Briahna Joy Gray, thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
It really is. It's been too long.
Has it?
Ooh.
No, I mean, like, haven't I been here fairly recently? Like.
All right, that was Briahna Joy Gray, everybody. We'll be right back. You can see yourself out.
No, I only mean to say that the experience, I guess, was so pleasurable last time that it stayed with me, and I feel like I never left.
There you go. Well, you sort of overcorrected a little bit, but it's cool. Okay, Katie, what is her name? Katie
Rouphie?
What? I mean, you know what? Just take it from here. What's the deal with her? Let's break this down. You got some controversy about this recently.
Well, I don't think that I'm at the center of the controversy, except insofar as that I think I am more willing to disaggregate some of the arguments that she makes.
Can you set her up for people first, or I mean?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So,
and then, but I think this is really important.
Okay, so my understanding is that she's someone who came to prominence in the 90s as a young 25-year-old, a recent Harvard graduate who was kind of anointed by the New Yorker as their new kind of it girl to talk about issues relating to sex and campus politics. Mm-hmm. And she made her name for herself by being kind of the controversial voice who, as a young woman, was invested with a certain amount of authority, and also was insulated from a certain degree of criticism to talk about things that basically contradicted what mainstream feminism was saying at the time. Right. So while she's always identified as a feminist, whereas there was an increasing awareness of rape culture on campuses and the idea of affirmative consent was getting wider and wider play, she was saying things that suggested that concern about rape on college campuses was overblown and talked in the vein of witch hunt, and that people were the pendulum was swinging too far in the opposite direction, and people took a lot of offense to that, understandably, because the pendulum had just started swinging from like full-blown, we're applauding rape scenes in movies, right? Like, we all grew up with these movies from the 80s and 90s where there's a classic scene, I think 16 Candles, where like our protagonist, nerdy kid, ends up getting to sleep with the passed out drunk cheerleader at the party, and we applaud that. Like that's like the turning point in the movie, and we all think it's great.
Remember Almost Famous? Remember that movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a scene like that. I mean, he doesn't go through with it, but I remember always being like, wait, this is supposed to be like
by the early
triumph
aughts
scheme. No, but it still was portrayed. Even in the early aughts, it was like, yeah, go for it, kiss her. I'm like,
spectrum, right?
She's out. She's out cold, dude. Like, don't touch her. What are you doing?
Yeah. So I think that represents a trajectory where we're getting better. But
and I think she also did sort of a literary analysis. Like she compared like Victorian guides of behavior with like new manuals coming out in college campuses in the 90s. So, and she got a lot of play because the like New York Times type media, they're not like, there's nothing they like better than a counterintuitive take. Like if you and I were sitting here, same demographics, same profile, like everything could be the same, but we were doing like the alt-right version of this show, we would already have massive exposure.
Yeah, look
like
at the new hires at the New York Times today.
Yeah,
Bari
Weiss, right. So that type of thing. So that's as old as the sun. Now, as you say, she's always considered herself a feminist. So so that's her sort of background. Now she's reemerged with a piece in Harper's, which I guess I want you to go ahead, but I'll just be the first one to sort of put this is not it's a kind of boring piece. This is not in any way a controversial piece of writing.
Well, so the controversy comes from what the piece was anticipated to say. So it was leaked, I think, in January that Harper's had commissioned her to write this piece about Me Too. Mm-hmm. And it was rumored that in this piece she was going to out the identity of the woman who had compiled this media men's list, right? Mm-hmm. That was a list of names of people in the industry who had committed a range of offenses ranging from is kind of like really creepy at parties to has fully actually raped people, right?
Right.
And this list was really controversial because people felt that it flattened the distinctions between those very different kinds of acts and kind of made all the men on the list more or less equally complicit or equally guilty.
It had like a list that basically you could. I mean, I actually never read the list, but like it's sort of like, but the notion being that like everything from arguably somebody who just doesn't like, and I don't mean like doesn't read social cues as an excuse to harass a woman, but I mean like literally like, you know, this guy's kind of weird on DM, which, you know, yeah, you shouldn't be, but to on the other hand, like, oh, this person should be in prison. Like if this person is doing this, they need to like not like forget like socially shunned. Like they need to not, or, you know, I don't want to think in a punitive sense, but like taken in a position where they cannot harm others because they're a public menace.
Right. So there was a lot of backlash to the list also because there was this sense that men had no recourse to rebut, you know, what had been said about them. It was private, and that people were kind of drawing conclusions about who they were, even if the crime were more minor, let's say, on the list, that it wasn't fair.
I DM great. I'm a good DMer.
Right? Like
people love my DMs. Like, no, they don't.
So given how controversial the list was, the idea that Rouphie was going to out this woman's name was really controversial as well, because this woman was getting death threats and all these other kinds of things from, you know, the dark corners of the involuntary celibate, you know, internet and all of that business. Who
dark corners? You know, I remember. I got to be careful. I maintain this, but it's just a funny. I know somebody who works in a realm of like security. And he's dealt with like actual like certain types of terrorism issues, and he also had to deal with some of the like, you know, men's internet stuff or another thing, and he was like, oh my, yeah, like fucking incel internet is so much scarier than Al-Qaeda. It's like, it's not even a comparison.
I believe it, but I think that the opening needs to, the left needs to try to exploit this opening a little bit more.
I agree.
I would love a world in which I could kind of post up somewhere and talk to these, because I do have, there's a sad nerd part of me that has a lot of empathy for sad nerds, and, you know, obviously doesn't endorse the appeal of whiteness that they seek out, but like definitely understands how it can be a slippery slope from feelings that rejected in a lot of different spheres, and toxic masculinity hurts men and blah blah blah.
That would be such a great book title.
It hurts men too, right?
Toxic
like,
masculinity hurts men.
It hurts
and blah,
everybody.
blah, blah. I love that.
I don't mean it that way. I sincerely
No, but I kind of do. Like I do what I do. But hey, yeah, go ahead.
So at any rate, all that is to say that it turns out that the woman outed herself prior to this article being written, right? So Rouphie maintains that she wasn't planning to actually name this woman. It's neither here nor there.
But she's not necessarily a trustworthy actor.
It's up in the air whether it's credible, the way that she tells the story, and that the way that she reached out to the woman Monaghan, I think her name is.
Is it Maura Donegan?
Donegan, sorry.
Something like that.
Something like that. The way that
some type of Irish like name. Just like I'm compiling a list.
All right.
Of bad DMs to everything in between.
All right.
So I do a Moira Donegan character. It's going to be color coded so you can tell the difference.
Okay. So
yeah, go ahead.
She outed herself.
Right.
And so it was a non-issue.
And she wrote a column, right?
She wrote a column, right.
Okay.
So it seemed to me, from my perspective, that a lot of the reaction to the Harper's piece had to do with one, Rouphie's reputation from the 90s and the kinds of things that she said back then, which a lot of which she repeats and which are genuinely objectionable, right? The way that which she kind of consistently diminishes the reality of rape statistics and the genuine threat that women face on campus and on college campuses and elsewhere, things like that, right? And I think another kind of leg of criticism rightly points out that she is kind of like hyperbolic, the way that she describes the Whisper Network, right? That she kind of, there's like a false equivalence that ends up being drawn between the nature of women having to, secretly circulate knowledge of men who are potentially abusive, and kind of the Twitter fervor that would be, hyperbolic about reacting to that, right? Mm-hmm. I think that, she exaggerates. But I also do think that because people were so animated by reacting to those other aspects of what she said, there were some more substantive and interesting arguments that she raises in the piece, and doesn't interrogate very well, mind you. I don't want to give her like too much credit.
Yeah, but it's not a good piece. It's just not nearly matching in the controversy it's generated. It doesn't. Was my read. Yeah.
And none of the responses, I think, were actually genuinely responsive. People were reposting takedowns from the 90s to her previous pieces, and I was like, this was a great takedown. I agree with everything in it.
Right.
All the criticisms are valid, but it has no relationship to what she's just written. And so I found myself really wanting to hear people flesh out what she had actually said, and also to entertain some of the things which I think are more the few legitimate parts.
What are those?
Okay, so one of them is she opens by saying, I talked to all of these women, but nobody would come on record with me, right? And people have been dismissing that as saying, well, it's because you're not a credible narrator and nobody trusts you with their story. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. These are obviously her friends that are legitimately talking to her.
Right.
But I do think that hesitancy to articulate any break with kind of Me Too doctrine is real. And I've experienced it on Twitter. I raised just the issue that a lot of these articles that are coming out are not particularly responsive, and I got heat from one of the New Republic editors that is named in this piece just for saying, oh, I should discuss this on my podcast. Like, should I talk about this on my podcast?
Should you talk about what specifically?
Whether or not there are some points that are worth considering. And my biggest bugaboo here is I've been talking for a while, and we talked about this in the first episode of Sotipod, about the idea of proportionality. And that is, you get all of these men, often in bad faith, arguing that there's no due process, right? And like putting aside that this is legal terminology being applied to instances in which the abuse alleged is often like non-criminal, it doesn't meet the level of criminality. I think that my approach to all of these things, whether I'm talking about race or identity politics or what have you, is to acknowledge that there are arguments being made in good faith or bad, and if there's a way to cut them off at the pass, why not do it? So to me, like, for example, Rouphie includes a lot of instances of people on Twitter who say really hyperbolic things like, there was a woman who I'm actually friends with from college who has a pseudonym and wrote... You're gonna laugh. Well, I won't say how I knew her because it'll be too easy to narrow down.
No, you got to do it.
No. Because she has an actual synonym.
Oh, okay, don't worry about it.
But who famously wrote a tweet.
We're gonna out her on today's show. Tweet it out. We're outing women.
Her internet. She tweeted famously. It doesn't matter if basically a bunch of some men go down or falsely accused. It's kind of the price that we have to pay for this movement, right? And I understand what she was trying to say. That there's a burden that, like it or not, is going to fall on one side or the other. The likelihood that we can perfectly balance this is slim, although we should endeavor to try. But that given the fact that throughout the whole of human history, that burden has fallen on women, she's not going to waste any crocodile tears if the burden now falls on men. Now, I don't think that's particularly constructive. And I, as a criminal justice advocate, am concerned with kind of overly punitive responses, right? I'm not one of those people who's going to sit up here and say, just because, the country ignored the crack epidemic means I'm going to
ignore the opioid
exactly
epidemic.
I don't think it's right to be tit for tat.
Well, and it's one thing to be tit for tat. Like, I have a real problem, and I understand that people on both sides are using this outside of a legal context, but I think it's like if you said, hey, because of the imbalance, like, more men are going to have to explain themselves now than women are going to have to hold things in, right? Like, if you said something on the cultural level, I think that's like, if you're in good faith and you're serious about the crisis, then you would say, yeah, that's true, and I'm willing to engage in that. But as soon as you bring that into the realm, I think that I just don't believe you're doing any. From my perspective, left politics is, pretty robustly anti-prison,
right,
and very serious. Like, I'm not an attorney, but I did, I'm still it was drilled into me, and my training was on the other end of better 100 guilty murderers walk free than one innocent. And that is, as terrible as that is, I actually really believe that if we're getting into a legal realm. And I think I want to get back to your explanation, but I also think it's problematic. A larger problem with capitalism is you can't just say now it isn't legal. You're just going to lose your livelihood, because if you have a system where people's livelihood is literally their ability to live, you can't just say that's a social sanctioning.
Exactly.
That has major implications. But anyways, go ahead.
Exactly. And some of the best Me Too articles, including by Alex Press, and even Rebecca Tracer wrote a good article on New York Mag, have addressed the fact that one of the most insidious parts of the Me Too movement, or not the Me Too movement, but the implications of it, are that women can't leave because they're constrained in all these other kind of ways, right? And so all of this stuff is working together.
Right. Right. It's also very much fundamentally a labor issue.
Right.
Yeah.
So my concern is with saying, okay, look, if the reality is that some percentage of men, even if largely in bad faith, are having this reaction because they believe that there is a kind of a slippery slope and that they will be lumped in with people who've done many worse things, right? Bill Maher did a takedown where he lamented the idea that people weren't adequately acknowledging the difference between someone like Al Franken and Trump. And it is true that there was a certain degree of pushback on Twitter for a long time if you raised the fact that there were differences in magnitude, because that was seen as trying to excuse the kind of lesser offenses, right? Mm-hmm. People couldn't hold in their brain at the same time. I can hold everybody accountable and at different levels.
Right.
And I think that part of why that is fundamentally is because we don't have an answer for what we want to do with these people as a society. So we have a criminal justice system that has a lot of misses, but that kind of basically is responsive to different kinds of crimes in a way that we find more or less adequate. Not us, because we're more leftist, but society finds more or less adequate and responsive.
Even the
to
most
what
punitive person says, okay, you got into some stupid fight at a bar and whatever, that's a disorderly conduct, maybe an assault charge, versus you killed somebody. And even in this society, we still make a distinction between it was a crime of passion versus, you plan this out for a couple of weeks, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And, race does affect that. 3 strikes laws, all kinds of things make the system unfair. But the point of the matter is that we have a sense of proportionality, even if it's not always followed through upon.
Right.
When it comes to sexual assault, both criminally and non-criminally, there is a sense in which our response as a society, or any kind of sex-related crime, is that that's it.
Right.
There's no sense of what rehabilitation looks like, if that's something that we want, if that's something that's possible. And that really makes me uncomfortable as a leftist who has certain rehabilitative justice goals, right? Yeah. So this is tied into a bigger question about how we stigmatize sex and sex crimes in our society. But if I, to try to not go down that road and kind of limit the discussion a little bit, I think that part of what's happening here is that, we acknowledge there is rape culture, right? We understand that there is a culture which made us all believe it was okay to watch those movies from the 20s, from 20 years ago, and not think they were a problem, to watch movies from 10 years ago and not see that rape as a problem, right? Mm-hmm. All of us, including women.
Right.
We understand that our sexual mores have changed, but that we were not always perfect sainted figures, and that people's expectations and knowledge of what is and isn't appropriate are changing at different levels.
Right.
Yet there's this insistence on viewing people who have committed sexual assaults of various degrees as kind of intrinsically monstrous, and then that it requires that they be kind of excommunicated from society forever.
Well, this is the other couple of things that I think are coming up here as a challenge, right? So I like your definition of rape culture because it's specific and I think it's true. But rape culture is also a term that gets so broadly thrown around that it can take on either like a really profoundly all-encompassing meaning, which might be true, but the practical effects upon are very difficult to enact, right? So I'll explain what I mean or you could take it really specifically like you, and I think you're totally right, and that's a valid use of it. But
well, how do you think, can you give me an example?
So I guess an example, what I'm trying to lead to is I think what's happening now is like there's the stigma around sex crimes specifically. And then there's this kind of like fusion, and other people have pointed this out, but I'll try to sort of distill it, where it's like, okay, there is some literature like Brown Miller or Andrea Dworkin or people who said essentially that like not only our society, but actually that fundamentally relations between men and women in a heterosexual sense are so innately violent and coercive. Everything from like the physical act of like how we have sex to the economic, like everything, right?
Yeah.
That you cannot separate. Like that's actually an argument that would actually say that not only could you not disaggregate fundamentally between the creepy DM and sexual assault, you can't even disaggregate what looks on the surface like, oh, those two people are in a relationship and they enjoy having sex with each other, because all of it is in this, you know, patriarch. And I think what's happening now in a certain strain is that this very all-encompassing critique, which I do in fact think is very flawed, but I think is worth reading and worth thinking about and engaging with and taking seriously, even if I disagree with it, is fusing together with how we solve problems in the society, which is criminalize everything. So I think if you fuse a very profound radical philosophical stance, which really is something to the effect of like all heterosexual relations are fundamentally suspect, and then you fuse it together with, and the answer we have to everything is just like punish, discard, get out.
Right.
That's a very, very problematic fusion. And I think that that's maybe what you're pointing to.
Well, that's one of the things that Rachel picks up on, right? And that she says that there is that kind of Dworkin-esque tendency that's creeping out in this current moment.
Right.
And I think that a lot of people reacted negatively to that. I think largely because I think most people actually don't feel that way. I think
most people totally don't feel that way. And all I'm saying is, and I don't, and I want to get back to you, but all I'm saying is that even if you did feel that way, I think it would be actually incumbent upon you. It's like making a relative and absolute distinction. Like someone should come out and say, look, my understanding and analysis of the world is that like all heterosexual sex is a form of assault because of these structures. That's what I believe. I think that is, people should really realize that is a totally minority position and not reflective of what most men and women think. That's just a truism. Right. But if that is your belief and you want to make that case, then you have to say, and at the same time, on a relative level, I am going to be really smart about saying, like, Joe Rogan's content or Matt Taibbi's writing is different than Al Franken, is different than Harvey Weinstein, and I'm not drawing a relative equivalency, but I'm saying this macro conversation I have, I want to implicate everybody, and that's my methodology. And that's what I think you have to do if you want to sort of forward that perspective. And I think also recognize, of course, it's a minority position.
Yeah. So I think the problem is that you don't get a legitimate analysis ever of what actually the extent to which there is some creep, because there is some creep, right? There is a way, and I don't think it's ill-intentioned, but I think there is a way in which when you are kind of used to being ignored and gaslighted, that there is a way in which you kind of rhetorically bolster what is going on as a way to gain credibility, right? So like, I'm a person of lacking some privilege, but of relative privilege in this world. And the way I move through spaces in the neighborhood I live in, compared to a lot of other women, most other women don't feel as much anxiety about sexual assault. And that's just the reality, because I live in a Tony neighborhood in New York City, right? But I still really empathize with women when we're having those conversations about, it's late and you're always wondering if you're going to get raped, and you look over your shoulder when you let yourself in your apartment. And that is all true. Like, I do wait for someone to pass before I go in my apartment, and I do like wait till I'm through the double locked doors and all of those other kinds of things. But I also know I can be honest with myself that I kind of can tell that narrative to the fullest extent, and as a way to kind of commune with other women in their experiences, in a way that it can be kind of like a hype crowd, right?
Yeah.
And we're all like, so there is sometimes creep in the way that women talk about, like, yeah, this man did this creepy thing at the bar, and in a different world, in a different context, it might be nothing. But in the aggregate with all these other women's stories, it's the same as with racial slights, right? Like, if a woman asked me in Banana Republic, do I work there? It might be innocent. But if it happens 10 times, I know that some proportion of those 10 times are irritating. And when I tell stories with other Black people, like, those stories aggregate and start to become something more, right? So I think that that's happening here, and I'm sympathetic to why it's happening. But I think that people who deny Rouphie's observations outright are doing themselves a disservice, because there is like a narrow critique to be made. And if men are reacting negatively to the extent to which hyperbole is making it sound like everyone needs to be punished kind of in a draconian way, or we're going to take the smallest actions and interpret them to be a big deal, then I think it's worth discussing as a community of women whether or not we want to be more definitive about what we actually think is happening and what we want to happen to the men who are the bad actors. Because I think a lot of this, and we saw this with the Aziz Ansari scenario, I think a lot of the controversy comes because most of these people aren't describing Al Franken things. Most people are describing the cat person and Aziz Ansari. And those stories are relatable because we've all been in situations where there's ambiguity. And that's something that Rouphie talks about at the end of her piece, is that there's a failure to acknowledge that there is genuine ambiguity on both sides across the sexes in a lot of these scenarios. And I think that the problem is there's this codification of what women feel and think that's happening that doesn't really reflect our experiences. So that, and the reality is, when you're in a hookup situation, with someone you've recently met, there's a kind of moment-to-moment decision-making process that's happening. Well, I like that they did that. I want to continue. I don't like that they did that. I learned something about who they are. They said this. They were rude in this way. They were considerate and got me a glass of water. And my mind is changing about how far I want to go. And that is a legitimate choice that should be respected. But also, I have to acknowledge that I might be sending mixed signals as a result of my choices, my desires genuinely fluctuating from moment to moment, and that creates a kind of a dangerous zone, right? Where if I'm not very definitive, there is a risk that consent is going to be assumed, and you're going to end up in one of these situations like Aziz Ansari, where she felt like her nonverbal should have been respected and acknowledged earlier, and he missed them. Now, I agree that her taking her hand off of his penis several times is a pretty conclusive. That's pretty conclusive. I don't want to touch your penis.
That's what I would call in the biz a tell.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's very obvious, but I think but I also just think it's also the larger, one hand, I actually want to kind of keep. I think there's three really important points to make. One is, I think that, and this is what we were touching on with Jordan Peterson earlier with Natalie from ContraPoint. It's like, when we are in a situation where these people, and I'll just use that in a very broad sense, whether it's Rouphie or Jordan Peterson or whoever, look, they're not this new crop of people like this, or Sam Harris, they're not Rush Limbaugh, they're not Sean Hannity, they're not these. They're gonna have a more sophisticated presentation, and I think that we run into a lot of danger when they find, and that's exactly what it is, it's a narrow point. And sometimes it's an important narrow point, sometimes it's a trivial narrow point, but they find a narrow point that's true. And we get panicked because unfortunately, I don't think we have the confidence in our views and arguments that we should, because that's what fear is a sign of. And we argue the obvious point versus just saying either with Jordan Peterson in the makeup case, it's okay, right, all humans enhance their appearance, right, Jordan? That is a brilliant, and what you're trying to extrapolate from that is crazy, right? Or whatever or in Rouphie's case, we could say, right, there is these ambiguities and interactions. Clearly, a lot of people are saying one thing in private and saying another in public. And that actually, in some ways, I would argue is a way bigger conversation about like the presentation of self and the social media age. Like there's a lot of implications of that. I would say, I mean, I do think that there is obviously like, this is what's so hard now is that like still the overall mass message is like, you know, even if it is nonverbal, and I think a lot of like, obviously sex is nonverbal, men still need to be like vastly more attuned and like empathetic and aware. And that is like a really fundamental thing that like can't get lost in all of this, right? Because that is like what incited it. But unfortunately now, like, because everything happens at once, we don't have time to table on any one thing anymore. We need to be synthesizers now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is more room for nuance than is being had now, right? Like I think that there are like response pieces that could have been written that took Rouphie down really actually much more substantively and thoroughly than what was actually written, by actually touching on, like at one point she kind of poo-poos the idea of affirmative consent.
Right.
Okay, that's we can win that one. That's easy. Like she vastly overstates what people mean by affirmative consent. We all know that 99 times out of 10, like everything's nonverbal and that's not an issue. But when we say prescriptively, it would be good. Like it would get around all of this if we had affirmative consent. That's not to say that we want people literally bringing consent forms into the bedroom, and she makes that ridiculous absurdist argument.
And you could just as easily flip at that. Like actually, what the point of this is that how come so many men in a college freshman orientation don't understand that you can't touch a woman when she's passed out?
Right.
That's absolutely horrifying and wrong, and clearly a reflection of incredibly warped messages. Not like, we're not doing a Dave Chappelle sketch here where we do like a fucking preamble sign up for everything, right? Like if we know this,
and so easy.
And if people came along and actually advocated that, we would happily argue against them.
Right. I mean, like, or if people want to do it, I have no like.
If they sure. If
people want to do it, they can.
Maybe
do
that's
it.
a new kink.
Right.
You do like a preset agreement for everything.
Or look, I'm an old head. A lot of these feminists, the problem is there's a lot of generational differences that are happening that are affecting how people are seeing this. Right. I'm 32 years old at this point. A lot of kids in college right now genuinely don't think it's particularly strange to the idea of bringing a consent form into a room or having very explicit affirmative consent conversations. And power to them, because at the end of the day, that's probably going to result in less sexual assault. So I'm not here to rag on that. But my point is that people aren't making specific arguments. People aren't addressing the nuanced arguments that people are making to the extent that they are nuanced, not just ham-handed. Yeah. And I think that we're losing a bigger battle as a result. And I think that the movement is not benefited from not taking seriously the question of what we actually want to happen. Once we get past the very legitimate outrage and sense of vindication that finally we're being heard, what do we actually want to happen to people? Because yes, there's rape culture, and yes, almost every man is implicated, right? And that is not to say everybody gets scared. Like if we had
David, can you take over for me for a second?
if we acknowledge that we don't want to excommunicate men, like if the result of being identified as someone who's been a bad actor in the past isn't to say you have to get out of society. And the way that we talk about race and we acknowledge the pervasive nature of racism isn't to say, well, I once said something effed up. You know, I once when I was 7 years old did, Chinese, Japanese, look at these with my eyes, right?
I never did that. I did one time mistake Brie for a Banana Republic associate, and I apologize.
You're not the first one. But like, if we're, we would never say that every little kid who said something racist or inappropriate, or so anybody who said the FAG and when they were 12 now means you're a homophobe and needs to get off the planet forever. Like, but we have this attitude towards sexual assault, and we started talking about this on my podcast with respect to Nate Parker, who's the director and star of Birth of a Nation, right? And if you recall...
that's right. May I have another beer, please, guys? And would you get her one
as
well?
I'll have another one. This is dinner.
Okay. So we're gonna but we should definitely get to the post game before we get to your prescriptions in that case. Yeah, please. So Nate Park, yes.
So the question
remind everybody of Nate Park just for a second.
So he came out with the movie Birth of a Nation that was, critically acclaimed before it was released in theaters, and everyone thought this was going to be a huge deal. He was kind of a rising star, but it turned out that publicly on his Wikipedia page the whole time his career was kind of building, that he had been charged with sexual assault in college, about 20 years before the movie coming out, and that he and his friend had both raped a passed out woman, but only his friend was convicted because the court at that time, because of rape culture, found Nate Parker not guilty because he had a previous sexual relationship with a woman, and they basically said she consented once, so she consented forever, right?
Which
so it was
is
trash.
Horrifying, grotesque.
It's horrifying
and it should be
and
noted legally that those types of truly abominable things of that type of case, there actually have been recent legal advances, and I'm forgetting the name. No, but I think this is actually also important in the conversation. I feel like sometimes people don't. It doesn't mean just because something is on paper doesn't mean it's being enforced or respected, and that's obviously in many cases not happening. But there have at least, like, in the formal legalistic sense, we have made some real advances.
Certainly,
with
until
regards to those things.
30 years ago, you couldn't rape your spouse, and the Violence Against Women Act did a lot of good in that respect.
Right.
So
anyways, okay. So
the
he
question now
committed.
becomes,
it seems so, but just
he did it. He did the act.
He did it.
Now he did the thing. He
Right.
never served time. Yada yada yada. So now all these years passed.
Right.
And it comes out that there are 2 rape scenes in this movie, and people are making the argument that you shouldn't see the movie because it's grotesque for someone who has raped someone to kind of fetishize rape and dramatize a rape that didn't happen in real life.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of other stuff that people can go back and listen to our Swoti episode that's like doesn't really track and suggest that there's some like subtext going on that doesn't really bear out the facts of how the movie actually went down. But the question that was interesting to me was, now he's a man who is, 37 years old or whatever, who's being asked about these questions. And at that time, this is before the Me Too stuff had blown up, gave one of the most, after a couple false starts, gave one of the best kind of responses in terms of taking accountability and talking about how he didn't understand what rape culture was. And today he's horrified at the notion that he would think it was okay to have sex with someone who was drunk and passed out. But back then he didn't think anything of it.
Going back to your earlier point.
That's my earlier point, that all of our consciousness has collectively changed. So
we've been toxified by this type of misogyny and film culture and rape culture.
So then I start to feel, I was younger then, so I'm not literally me, but like I feel ambivalent about then holding this guy to a standard that I would have agreed to arguably back in the 90s, right? Like there's a version of me that was of age and in the 90s that also wouldn't have understood as clearly. Now it's trash that the world is that way. That's all. There's lots of people who did understand in the 90s that you shouldn't have sex with someone passed out, right? But I think that the level of how angry and how how much we want to kind of we can't put him in jail, right? Like that ship has sailed, right? So when we're talking about social accountability, what society should do and how society should punish Nate Parker, I have several questions. And I don't know how to answer these, but my questions are: how much does the fact of time passing matter? How much does the fact of the kind of cultural context and our cultural understanding between what happened then and where we are now matter?
Right.
How much does the fact that he seems to have taken accountability for what he did and now is going around the college campuses giving seminars on how not to date rape and stuff like that, how much does that matter?
Right.
How much does it matter that it turns out that this woman in the intervening years, about 7 years after the rape, committed suicide?
Jesus.
Well,
that's fucking depressing.
Yes, and then the news story linked that very much to him, which it wasn't clear to me that was fair.
Yeah, that's
she had a child and had divorced father and all this other stuff in the interim that's very traumatic for people, and who knows how much of it. Certainly his act could not have contributed.
Right, of course. But that might not necessarily be
But who knows?
Right.
So my question is not I want to let Nate Parker off the hook at all.
Right.
But my question is I want a more acutely articulated rationale for how we should address these things. Because what I know that I don't want the answer to be anybody who's committed any kind of sexual transgression is completely kicked out of society forever, because that's just not sustainable. Because it's everybody.
Right. And I think what's interesting though is I feel like it's definitely a dialectic because in order to let's not flatten. So there are people that are, committing assaults. Now there are people who've engaged, like, Harvey Weinstein, like this sort of almost like racketeering of sexual crimes, right? But in order to have this type of that was kind of the point I was trying to make earlier with and we're sort of tabling, like, neither of us, I don't think, share the sort of Dworkin Brown Miller perspective. But that being said, okay, discard that perspective. But if we were going to take on this broader perspective that look, there is a toxic sexual culture which implicates all of us, and of course implicates men, because there's literal just power disparities,
and
right?
women too,
and
who
women
are taught to be coy and to not be explicit about what we want sexually.
And all of it. So, but you would need to actually create a container, it would almost need to be like a truth and reconciliation commission of our national sex culture, because I think the best case scenario right now of what's happening is I see in some quote unquote normie outlets, I totally think this is filtering through, and men who don't listen to a bunch of podcasts or whatever and aren't performing, being woke, they're starting to think a lot more I noticed this. I don't want to get into detail, but I even I was in LA and talking to my Lyft driver, and he's a young dude, so he wants to talk about clubs and everything, and I don't remember, but he said something that I noticed was literally, I was like, oh, that's a shift. That's great. That's somebody who, it's a positive shift. It's filtering. No, I think for certain people, the conversation, that's the real positive effect in this. Conversely, I think that there's going to be a whole other parallel discourse where it will just be another costume to wear. It will be another way of showing how enlightened you are. But there's a thing it's discoursing democracy versus practicing democracy. We can discourse anything, but what are we actually practicing? Yeah. And I think in order to do that, it is going to require, and I hate to be look, I don't play this game. I just say what I think in my assessment of things, but I am aware that I'm a straight male saying this, but it's literally you can't let any of us off the hook, but it's going to require precisely the opposite attitude to a few innocent may fall.
Right.
Because everybody's going to back the fuck off of that.
I think that's right.
And everybody's going to react to that. And you know what? They're not totally wrong in reacting to that, because fuck you.
It's
why would
shitty.
Why would anyone accept that? That's a garbage, punitive, fascist attitude,
it's the same
which we should oppose in all ways, shape, and form.
Anyways. I get this a lot with this race stuff, right? Because that's my real beat, this identity politics stuff, where I talk a lot on the internet about how there's a cohort of black people who say things or people of color generally, and white people who vocally agree with them, who say things
right.
It's not our job to convince white people, right? It's not our job to convince Trump voters. It's not our job to convince racist white people. It's not our job to convince Republicans of anything.
Okay.
Which, totally, you're not obligated to do anything in this world.
Don't do that.
Life is hard. Life is hard as a person of color. Feel like no one personally, individually is obligated to do anything at all. However, you are the only one, in my view, who's personally invested, who has skin in the game. So I do feel like, for my own self-interest, I do want to engage people whose voting is going to directly impact my life and the life of the people that I love.
Right.
And similarly, it's shitty that I have to both be the victim and go out here proselytizing to people and be doing the work. But the reality is, apart from a handful of well-meaning white people or men or people who are whatever outside of your group, that's just how the chips fall. Right. And so I think that being patient, and two, understanding that I think by saying it's everyone, I don't mean that in a scary way. I mean that in a way that almost just to make it more approachable, in the same way I say everybody's racist, I'm racist, we all have racist biases. Because I was talking about this with my co-host on our first episode of this season, and I first asked him, well, what would you do if someone in your social circle, someone who you knew, was accused of rape?
Yeah.
Because this happened to me. I went back to my law school 5-year reunion, and there was a guy who very famously had been kicked out of law school and was back when I was at my 5-year. He had to take a 4-year leave of absence.
He had been allowed to re-enter after a 4-year leave of absence.
There was no criminal charges. Okay. It was one of these kind of drunk digital penetration. The Hunting Game movie, Hunting Games.
The Hunting Games?
There was a movie about it.
Oh, okay, I don't know this movie.
So he had digitally penetrated one woman and kissed another, two friends of his. They were all in bed together, right? And so I knew this guy in passing, right? Hey at parties.
Right.
I see him at my 5-year reunion, and I'm confronted with, now what do I do?
Oh, do you say like, well, you are out?
Right. Do I turn my back and, do I act like nothing's wrong and therefore seemingly care more to his feelings?
How are you?
I don't know the women. Right. Like I have no relationship. So it's not like a personal thing. But as a woman, I'm, at the same time, I know all the facts of the case because I was curious. And I know that he reacted kind of the best way you can to have done something like that. So he's like, oh, gosh, you're like and the texts were leaked the next day. Right. Oh, gosh, you're right. I shouldn't have done that. I'm so sorry. I violated your friendship.
They were not conscious while this happened?
The whole gang was drunk. Not that that's absolving him, right? Of course, but the whole gang was drunk. The two women were passed out, and he kind of like
I just
digitally penetrated one of them.
I just wanted to be clear with the I understand.
Yeah. So in the grand scheme, the hierarchy of all the things that can happen. Obviously, it's a horrible violation, but like it's not a Weinstein, right? Like, all of these factors are playing in my head. And I'm
conversely, it's not a Franken either.
It's not a Franken either. It's like, now what do I do? And so when I told that story to my co-host, he was like, well, I wouldn't have talked to him. And so then I asked him, how would you feel if that person were our mutual friend and I said a name?
Hopefully not a real name.
Like Bob, whatever, like a fake name. Like, I used an initial so he knew what I was talking about. But
don't bring me into this. I'm sorry. Absolutely not David Grisham. I'm sorry. I apologize.
But his whole attitude switched because we can imagine.
Sorry again.
I think a lot of us can imagine our friends or relatives effing up like that, right? Like doing something like feeling up a girl when she's drunk in bed. Like, I think that was a lot less.
Now honestly, I really can't. I'm not even lying to you.
I don't know who you know. I can't.
I really can't. But at the same time, like,
you can't imagine a friend of yours going out and having a consensual night and everybody's drinking and everybody's having a good time.
And then feeling up a girl
and then you're both in bed, you're both half out of it and feeling her up in a way and digitally like taking it, like penetrating her and then going to sleep.
This is such a weird conversation, but maybe the feel. I don't know. I feel like I don't know. Whatever. Anyways,
that doesn't seem like it's possible. Stretch to me. It really doesn't.
It's sorry. I'm not. I won't go to the math for it. It just hasn't occurred to me.
So then suddenly, or even if it's a lesser offense, but the kind of offenses that are on the list, right? The media men list.
Right.
Suddenly he was like, oh, well, yeah, like I might not publicly, like Lena Dunham foolishly publicly defended that guy.
Well, that's a whole other thing. She trashed the accuser.
Right.
That wasn't even just for her friend. She trashed the woman who was making the claim.
Right. Yeah. But the impulse to say, I'm more willing to reserve judgment for someone that I know versus someone that I don't know, I think is very human.
Yeah, of course.
Frankly, I would want my friend to do that for me, right?
Well, no doubt.
I would hope that they
got you.
They factored in our long relationship into making, the way that the public can't and shouldn't.
Right.
So I think that there's a way in which, because women rightfully are eager for justice finally, that some of these finer, very human reactions and these finer details and distinctions are getting erased. And I think that people like Rouphie are responding in part to that. A large part of it, she's just being trash.
Yeah, she's just being trashy, contrarian.
She's just being trashy, contrarian.
Right.
But there is this nugget, I think, like what your point about Peterson and all these people is they make these narrow points. And I think that often by ignoring or being overly dismissive of those narrow points, we lose a lot of credibility. And people like Peterson and the guy whose podcast I just said, Ben Shapiro, they get a lot of traction for seeming like they're reasonable because they accept or give credit to some segment of the other side's perspective.
Right.
And I think that we could do more of that, not just to win like kind of like the political or rhetorical public battle, but also because I think that when you behave in terms of black and white, you commit injustices. Yeah. And I think that the due process stuff is overstated, but I do think that it is right to be concerned about what happens to people.
Yeah.
Right? And
that's
not
sort of the purpose of our politics.
That's the purpose of our politics.
That's why we were concerned about things like sexual abuse to begin with.
That's why. And it's not an eye for an eye. And it's really, really shitty. It's really shitty that the crack epidemic was ignored.
Right.
But we cannot take it out on the victims of the opioid.
We can always remember the history and point out the difference.
We should.
But we're going to do right now.
We should. And every writer who makes this point should say, it is awful that women have never been believed. And I'm going to give credit to the emotional response that's happening right now.
Yes.
And Rebecca Tracer's article did a good job of doing that. The reason that she didn't get blowback from raising some of the same points that Rouphie raised in terms of there being some over-exaggeration and over-correction right now is because she properly contextualized it in the history of what's going on right now.
That's right. Right.
And I mostly don't agree with her, but she broke her foot off in that last New York Me Too piece. But I think that if we don't, go forward with that kind of nuance, then we're going to end up actually handicapping the movement that is important.
Nuance is actually okay. Now, here's something that's not nuanced. We're going to go to the post game. Briahna Joy Gray is going to stay with us. We have a very toxic game, but it is a fan request. We're playing Hey. I'm not even going to tease it. It's just we got a game coming up.
Speaking of rape culture.
Well, that's not just rape culture. This is broader objectification culture.
But
down. Really, that's supposed to be that shouldn't even be that should just be more like gulag or re-education like we did with Felix. Just a slightly different version. We're going to take your calls. We're going to take your IMs. Thank you, new patrons. So we got several new people during the show. Appreciate all of you. We do this free of oligarch influence, free of ownership. I'm accountable to you and only you. Thanks to all of you. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, super producer Matt Leck. Thank you, David Grisham, head theoretician. Thank you, super producer David Slavic. This Sunday, brand new illicit history. We'll see you in a few minutes in the post game.